Hi, my name is Alan McGraw, and this is my journal for Module 2 regarding veterans of the Civil War. So, the first question for the journal is, what are the main themes of this module's material? So, the main themes I came up with for this module's material was, first off, uh, the theme of large veterans associations, the large associations that came about following this war. Groups like the Grand Army of the Republic for Northern soldiers, and the United Confederate Veterans for Southern soldiers. These groups largely were started as a means for veterans to get together with other people who had experienced similar things. Started a lot with local chapters. Guys would join their local chapter, and these organizations, some of them, like the two I just mentioned, grew to be quite large and were actually quite influential semi-political organizations in terms of pushing for better treatment of veterans, better pensions, better medical care, things of that nature. So that was one big theme. Another big theme was veterans homes. So these were homes initially for disabled veterans who had been maimed or otherwise wounded severely in combat, and these were places where they could go live and be cared for. These were federally and state-funded homes. In the South, they were all state-funded, as the federal government didn't pay for any down there. But in the North, there were mixes of both. And these homes were the people they helped expanded over time to where, as James Martin states in his book Seeing Not War, by 1910 about 5% of the living Union veterans were living in one of these homes. It was about 32,000 soldiers, ex-soldiers, veterans. So quite a large population living in these state or federally funded homes. Another major theme I saw in this module were pensions. They're something that had been around, but they were massively expanded following the Civil War, in large part just due to the massive amount of men who fought in this conflict. Initially, they started off more limited for pensions just for wounded veterans or the widows and orphans of those who had been killed in battle. And as the years went by, they were expanded further and further until by the early 1900s, they are age itself had become considered a disability, so that any veteran of the Union Army could apply and be accepted to receive pensions strictly because of their age, and not because they were wounded in battle or even saw combat. There were differences in the pensions. Union soldiers, obviously, their pensions were far higher than those of soldiers in the South. Again, the federal government funded the Union pensions, and in the South, the states had to take that upon themselves. So Martin states on page 17 of his book that in the 1890s, the average Union soldier's annual pension was $160, whereas the average Confederate soldier's annual pension was $40. So, the Union soldiers got 4 times more than their Confederate counterparts. The last major theme I took from this module was the mental toll that this conflict seemed to take on the soldiers. It was something that had certainly been around in prior conflicts, but it was during this conflict that for the first time scientists and doctors began to see it as a big issue, and also battlefield commanders, as more and more soldiers went down with these mental illnesses. At the time, they were not seen so much as illnesses as much as just soldiers shirking on their duty or not doing the duty they were supposed to do. It was not as well understood, but it was the first time that the doctors and scientists began to suspect that there was more to it than that. So on to the second question, and the second question I'm going to tie in with the third question. So the second question is, what are the most significant continuities and changes you've seen in this module? And the third, that somewhat ties into the third question, which is, how did the major points of evolution come about? So the continuities I saw in this period were the pensions for veterans, as an obvious one. It was something that had been around for Revolutionary War veterans and the veterans of the War of 1812 and the Mexican-American War. So the Civil War was just another step along that path, and it was something that had been done before, and though it was expanded largely during this period, it was still something that was familiar to the American people. Also, the high levels of respect for veterans. So Union and Confederate veterans alike were greeted joyfully as they got home and were treated with respect, and that is something that has been common to most veterans of most conflicts throughout American history. So the changes that I noticed were the pensions, which were a continuity, were also a change because of how wide-ranging they became during this period, and how large they were. Just so many more men fought in this population, percentage of population-wise, than in any prior conflict, and that made it just a bigger burden on the federal government. And also the fact that they expanded the pensions to cover not only the widows and orphans of those killed and those severely wounded, but eventually to cover all veterans who reached a certain age. So, that began to become a larger part of the federal budget, was paying pensions to veterans. Also, the psychological toll was greater, and a lot of that was due to the technology increases. So in prior wars, such as the Revolutionary War and the War of 1812, soldiers were very rarely actually in combat. Most of their time was spent marching, drilling and things like that, and also just searching for the enemy and kind of waiting to find a place to fight them, an appropriate place to fight. And with the great distances involved and all of it having to be done on foot, for the most part, it just took a long time between battles, and they were few and far between. Whereas with the development of the railroad, troops could be moved to places relatively quickly, and so they spent more time in combat than soldiers of prior wars. And also the development of the increase in weapons technology, so things like the rifle, just made war more lethal, which tends to have a greater psychological toll on those fighting in it. When your chances of death are greater, naturally you are going to be more susceptible to cracking under the pressure that is put on you. And so that was a lot of the reason for those changes. So the most interesting thing I learned in this module was that the victorious soldiers, the Union soldiers, tended to almost be treated less favorably than the Confederates. So it's described in Martin's book that the Union veterans, over time, and this was more of a gradual thing than right at first, over time, with the booming economy and things like that, a lot of veterans began to fall behind, and some turned to drinking or crime or other things like that, and so it began to give Northern veterans kind of a bad name that they had to fight against, and it ended up making it to where in the latter part of the 19th century, they were actually viewed more as a drain on society than a positive thing, and not they weren't looked up to quite like they had been before. Whereas Confederate veterans enjoyed kind of a constant, somewhat heroic status in the South following the war, and were kind of seen as just monuments to the lost cause. Just individuals who had given it all for uh, what they believed, and though they had failed, they were still honored for trying, and things along those lines. So I thought that was very interesting, the difference in the way the two sides were treated, even though you would think the winning side would, their soldiers would be hailed as heroes and all that, even more so than the losing side, but that actually tended to be the opposite after this war. The next question is to create a thesis for this module's material. My thesis for this module's material would be that the Civil War was the first war that America faced that involved more than half of the fighting age men, that they were actually enlisted and served in the military in some form or another. Before, it had been very small portions of the population that had been involved. So the fact that so many men participated in it, as such a large portion of the population, along with the massive amounts of casualties that were a result of this war and the new modern technology used in it, led to an influx of veterans, many of them wounded or disabled, into the post-war population. This influx led to stress on the society as a whole, both financially and sociologically, as these men tried to reintegrate into society. The next question, number 6, is to discuss how this module's material connects with the material of the previous module. The way I saw it connecting was, one was the pensions, something that had been done in both for veterans of all prior wars, the Revolution, War of 1812, and it was continued here and still continues to this day. So that was one common thread. Another was the continuing respect of veterans, especially in the South, but also in the North. Obviously not all of them were looked upon negatively, as men like Ulysses S. Grant ends up becoming president due to his exploits in the war. Also, another common thread was the politicization of veterans affairs, especially with groups like the Grand Army of the Republic. It was natural that politicians were going to try and entice groups like that by making certain promises to them or concessions to them in order to try and get them to vote a certain way. And so again, which this is something that had been seen as early as the Revolution, but that veterans affairs became a political issue that happened. That was a common thread in this unit, this module. So the last question in my journal, I'm going to be doing a historiography, so question 8 is the one that applies to me, and it says to discuss and prove a major assertion of the narrative discussed in this module. So the narrative that I think can be proven by these primary sources in this module is the narrative regarding the psychological toll this war took. So both the sources I mainly used were Bernard Roscoe and his book Providing for the Casualties of War, and also James Martin's Sing Not War. So both of them describe at length some of the psychological issues that were experienced by soldiers, and also how those soldiers were viewed. As Roscoe puts it, and Martin puts it very similarly, many of these soldiers who were experiencing mental issues following combat, following battles, were treated as shirkers or cowards, and many, if they were caught, cowering somewhere, they would be shot for dereliction of duty, and it was really not well understood at all, this issue. But this war was the first war in which psychiatric casualties actually began to be recognized as militarily significant, as Rosker states. So it started to happen in large enough numbers that the military commanders had to begin to take notice and begin to realize, even though they didn't come anywhere close to understanding, that this issue was bigger than just cowardice and things like that, and there was something deeper and something else going on. Another piece of proof towards that is some of the self-mutilation and suicide that's described by Martin in his book Seeing Not War. So he references several different stories. One of a guy who was just acting strangely, combing his hair all the time, and then at one point just stated that he was not going to sleep in the house again, and went out to his barn and shot himself. Another man who had cut his own throat 3 times and ended up dying later on. And he also references a hospital in Indiana that was a hospital / asylum in Indiana that was housing some mentally people that were veterans that were having mental issues. They saw 51% of the veterans they were housing either attempt or successfully commit suicide, which is just an astounding number. And so it was things like that that began to draw people's attention to the mental issues that go along with serving in a conflict. And though it wasn't really ever understood during this period of time, these were the first steps in a process that now obviously we know far more about, though don't know everything about, post-traumatic stress disorder and things of that nature. And whereas back then this was really the first step taken to realizing this is a mental illness, not just someone's choice, choosing to be this way. So anyway, that is all for my journal, and I thank you for watching.